As far as the mark, that comes from the end of Mark, which practically every scholar, every Bible scholar in the world says was not authentic, that this was a later addition. And so that's not in the early source material. As far as our earliest records don't have that part about the poison.
Another big difference. The Gospel of Mark. Mark is probably my favorite gospel because it's so subtle and understated in places, and it says things that you don't expect. And nowhere is this more true than in the ending of Mark's gospel. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is put on trial, and he's crucified, he's dead, he's buried, and on the third day, the women go to the tomb. The tomb is empty, and Jesus is not in it. There's some man in there. And the man tells the women that Jesus is not here, he's been raised from the dead. He tells the women, go tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. And then it says the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. That's where it ends. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. And you think, how could it end there? I mean, they're told to tell the disciples, but they don't tell anybody. Didn't the disciples ever learn? Didn't they go to Galilee? Didn't they see Jesus? How could that be the end of the story? And that's exactly the reaction the scribes had. They got to that ending, they said, how could it end there? And scribes then decided it couldn't add there, and so they added 12 verses. So that in your English Bibles today, you'll find 12 more verses after that, after chapter 16, verse 8. And often they'll be in double brackets, because the translators will tell you in a footnote, these verses weren't originally in here. These were added by later scribes. In these verses, in these added verses the scribes added later, but we know they're added later because they're not in the earliest and best manuscripts. The writing style is different from the rest of the Gospel of Mark, and in fact there are inconsistencies between this ending and the verses that precede it. So this is clearly an addition to the Gospel of Mark. In these final verses, according to these final verses, the women do go tell the disciples do go to Galilee, they do meet Jesus there, and Jesus then tells them that they're to make disciples of all the nations, and people who become his disciples will be able to speak in foreign languages that they previously didn't know. They'll be able to handle deadly snakes, and they'll be able to drink poison and it won't harm them. These are the verses that the Appalachian snake handlers in my part of the world use to base their liturgical practices on. I've always thought that sometime in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, somebody should point out, well, actually those verses aren't in the Gospel of Mark. Mark actually ends with the women not saying anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Somebody added the last 12.